I've got a John Doe and a description. I don't need warrants. Lower your voice and leave this room. I'm taking him now. Keep blocking me and you're coming downtown too.
Let me tell you about a night that changed everything for one man. A night where 23 years of service came crashing down in the hallway of a hospital. Where assumptions met reality. Where a badge wasn't enough. This is a true story. And before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Because what happened on this night, it could happen anywhere. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. You're going to want to hear how this unfolds. It's 11:42 p.m. on a Friday night in Atlanta. The fluorescent lights of Grady Memorial Hospital hum quietly in the intensive care unit. Most of the city is winding down, heading home, settling into their weekend. But in this hallway, two men are about to collide in a way that will be studied in law enforcement training for years to come. Detective Marcus Shaw walks off the elevator with purpose. 23 years on the Atlanta Police Department, 8 years in the gang unit. He's confident. He knows what he's doing. At least that's what he thinks. Standing outside room 417 is another man, 6 feet tall, wearing jeans and a casual button-down shirt. To Marcus, he looks like, well, maybe hospital security, maybe a visitor. Definitely not someone who's going to tell him what to do. But that man? That's Special Agent David Chen. FBI. 15 years investigating organized crime. And he's standing exactly where he needs to be, protecting exactly who he needs to protect. Marcus doesn't see the credentials on David's belt. Or maybe he sees them but doesn't really see them, because sometimes we see what we expect to see, not what's actually there. Let me back up, because to understand what's about to happen, you need to understand these two men, where they came from, what brought them to this moment. David Chen grew up in the neighborhood south of Atlanta. His father delivered mail. 6 days a week, rain or shine, his dad walked those streets. His mother taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. They weren't wealthy, but they were respected. They believed in service. In doing things the right way. David was 16 when his cousin got caught in gang crossfire. His cousin survived, but barely. And David watched his neighborhood live in fear. Good people, hardworking people, afraid to trust the system to protect them. That changed something in David. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. Real justice. The kind that actually made communities safer. He went to Emory University. Criminal justice major, top of his class, then straight to Quantico, the FBI Academy. Finished in the top 5% of his training class. But here's what made David valuable to the Bureau. He didn't just understand the law from textbooks. He understood the streets. He understood how criminal organizations work because he'd seen them operate his whole life. For 15 years, David had been building cases, human trafficking rings, money laundering operations, drug distribution networks that spanned 6 states. He'd helped take down gang leaders who thought they were untouchable. And he did it all by building cases so airtight that even the best defense attorneys couldn't tear them apart. David specialized in patience. Federal investigations take time, months, sometimes years. Surveillance, informants, financial analysis, building relationships with potential witnesses. You can't rush federal cases, and once the FBI invests that kind of time and resources, they protect that investment. Marcus Shaw? Different story entirely. He'd been on the force for 23 years. Started as a patrol officer, worked his way up. For the last 8 years, he'd been in a specialized gang unit. And Marcus had a reputation. He got results. He made arrests. He closed cases. But Marcus also had a file. 9 citizen complaints in 5 years, excessive force, improper conduct. The department investigated everyone. Found them unsubstantiated or unfounded. 3 civil lawsuits. The city settled all of them, combined total somewhere in the 6 figures. But Marcus? He faced no real consequences because Marcus got results. He believed that if someone looked guilty, acted guilty, fit the description, you could sort out the legal details later. The courts would handle it. That's what they were there for, right? Here's a question for you watching. Have you ever seen someone in authority make assumptions they later regretted? Think about it. Drop your answer in the comments. For 14 months, David had been working one case, one major investigation, a drug distribution network operating throughout Atlanta and beyond. The organization was sophisticated, street-level dealers connected to suppliers, money laundering operations, the whole infrastructure. Multiple subjects were under investigation, federal charges were being prepared, and David had been working on one particular person, a man named Carlos Rivera, 29 years old, mid-level in the organization. Not leadership, but positioned perfectly. Carlos knew things, names, operations, structure, and most importantly, Carlos was starting to understand that cooperating with the FBI might be his best option. For months, David had been building that relationship, showing Carlos the evidence, explaining his legal exposure, offering him a chance to help himself by helping the investigation. And 2 days before that Friday night, Carlos said yes, he was ready to talk, ready to cooperate, ready to provide information that could bring down the entire network. This was huge. Carlos could identify key players, describe operations, potentially testify. His cooperation would strengthen the federal case considerably. Then, Friday night, 9 p.m., Carlos was leaving a convenience store when shots rang out from a passing vehicle. 2 bullets hit him, shoulder and torso. He was rushed to Grady Memorial, emergency surgery. The doctors said he'd survive, but he needed monitoring. Internal injuries, risk of complications. David got the call at 9:47 p.m. He was at home reviewing case files when his phone rang. One of his team members who'd been maintaining surveillance. Carlos had been shot. They didn't know if it was related to his decision to cooperate or just random violence. David arrived at the hospital within 20 minutes. He coordinated with hospital security, positioned agents at key locations, made it clear to the staff that this patient was involved in a federal investigation and access needed to be restricted. Carlos came out of surgery around 11:15 p.m., stable but sedated, hooked up to machines in a private ICU room. David stayed close, coordinating with his team, making sure everything was secure. Then at 11:42 p.m., Detective Marcus Shaw stepped off that elevator. Marcus was working a case, a shooting from 3 weeks earlier outside a nightclub. Gang-related? He had a witness description of the suspect. Black male, late 20s, medium build, visible tattoos. Now, let's be real. That description could match thousands of men in Atlanta. But Marcus had convinced himself he knew who did it. He just needed to find him. When Marcus heard about a shooting victim matching that general description at Grady Memorial, he decided to investigate. No warrant, no coordination with the hospital, no notification to his supervisor. Just his badge and his certainty. Marcus had no idea that Carlos Rivera was under federal protection. No idea that the FBI had been working this case for over a year. No idea that the man in jeans standing outside that hospital room was a federal agent with clear authority over this situation. And when Marcus saw David, he made an assumption, a costly one. He saw someone he didn't recognize as authority, and his brain filled in the blanks based on what he expected to see. Marcus approached with confidence. "I've got a John Doe and a description. I don't need warrants." David's response was calm but firm. "Lower your voice and leave this room." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an instruction. But Marcus wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not by someone in jeans. "He matches my suspect. I'm taking him now." There was something in Marcus's tone, a dismissiveness, an assumption that David would step aside. That authority meant a police badge and nothing else. David had heard that tone before, many times. This is a hospital. You don't have jurisdiction here. Marcus's demeanor shifted. The confidence cracked just slightly. Keep blocking me and you're coming downtown too. That's when David asked a question that should have changed everything. You really want to do this on camera? Look up. Security cameras throughout the ICU, recording everything, every word, every movement. David knew it. The hospital staff knew it. Marcus either didn't know or didn't care. I don't care who you think you are, Marcus said. David's reply was clear, final. Then you should, because I'm federal. This patient's under protective custody. Those words, federal protective custody, should have stopped everything right there. Federal authority supersedes local jurisdiction in federal investigations. A patient under protective custody means law enforcement has specific legal authority to control access. But Marcus had already committed. And pride. Pride is a dangerous thing. He tried to move past David. David didn't yield. He held up his FBI credentials, making sure the camera got a clear shot. I'm Special Agent David Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This patient is under federal protection as part of an ongoing investigation. Any attempt to access or question him without federal authorization constitutes interference. Marcus claimed he had a warrant. David asked to see it. Marcus pulled out his phone, searched for something, finally showed David a department-wide alert from 3 weeks earlier. That general description again? Black male, late 20s, medium build, tattoos. David looked at the description, then at Carlos through the hospital room window. What specific articulable facts connect this particular patient to your investigation? The description matches. That description could match hundreds of people. That's not probable cause. Let me ask you something, folks. Do you think the detective already knew he'd made a mistake? Or was he too deep in to back out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Marcus's voice got louder. You're obstructing my investigation. David remained calm. You're interfering with a federal investigation, which carries serious consequences. Then Marcus made the choice that would end his career. He reached for his handcuffs. I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction. David didn't move. His voice carried clearly, for the cameras. You are attempting to detain a federal agent who is protecting a subject in a federal investigation. I'm advising you that this action constitutes interference with federal law enforcement. Stop immediately. Marcus didn't stop. He grabbed David's arm. What happened next was quick. David, trained in defensive tactics like all FBI agents, used a standard control technique. Nothing excessive, nothing violent. Just enough to remove Marcus's unauthorized grip. Remove your hand. You are not authorized to detain me. This is your final warning. Marcus's hand moved toward his weapon. He didn't draw it. But his hand went to the holster. And everything changed. David's backup agents moved in. Hospital security responded. David's voice cut through the tension. Do not touch that weapon. If you draw on a federal agent, you will face serious consequences. Step back. Immediately. Marcus froze. His hand stayed on the holster, but he wasn't drawing. He looked around. FBI agents, hospital security, cameras recording everything. And slowly the reality began to sink in. Remove your hand from your weapon, David instructed. Take 3 steps backward and wait for your supervisor, who I'm calling right now. Marcus complied. The color had drained from his face. The confidence was gone. Replaced by the gradual, horrible understanding that he'd just threatened a federal agent while that agent was lawfully performing his duties. And every moment was on video. David called the liaison to the FBI field office. Professional, brief. He explained the situation and requested a supervisor respond immediately to address Detective Marcus Shaw, who had just attempted to interfere with a federal protective operation. 15 minutes later, Captain Robert Martinez arrived. 28 years with APD. He'd worked with federal agencies. He understood jurisdictional protocols. He knew David Chen's reputation. When Robert saw Marcus standing in that hallway, surrounded by FBI agents and hospital security, stress written all over his face. Robert knew this was serious. He asked David to explain. David did, calmly and precisely, the federal protection, Marcus's unauthorized demands, the threats, the physical contact, the reach toward his weapon. Robert listened. Then he turned to Marcus. "Is this accurate?" Marcus tried to explain. The suspect description, the matching details, just performing his duties. "Did you get a warrant?" "No." "Did you coordinate with the hospital or check if the patient was involved in another investigation?" "No." "Did you identify yourself to the FBI agents before trying to access the room?" "No." Robert looked up at the security camera. "Does the footage capture all of this?" The hospital security supervisor confirmed it did. Multiple angles, with audio. "Quick question for you. Do you think the captain already knew this was career-ending? Let me know what you think." Robert directed Marcus to surrender his duty weapon and return to the station immediately. Marcus started to protest. "Surrender your weapon now. You just grabbed a federal agent and reached for your gun." "On camera. We're not discussing this here." Marcus handed over his service weapon. As the elevator doors closed, you could see it on his face, the adrenaline fading, reality setting in. David stayed at the hospital for several more hours. He filed a detailed report, requested copies of all security footage, documented everything while it was fresh. The FBI's response was swift. By the next morning, a formal complaint had been submitted to Atlanta PD Internal Affairs. The complaint detailed Marcus's attempted interference, his attempt to unlawfully detain a federal agent, and his threatening behavior. The FBI noted they weren't pursuing federal charges at this time, but that decision was contingent on appropriate disciplinary action. Internal Affairs moved fast. They obtained the footage. And they watched everything. Marcus approaching the ICU, disregarding David's credentials, demanding access, threatening arrest, physically grabbing a federal agent, reaching for his weapon. They interviewed hospital staff. Everyone confirmed David's account. Several mentioned that Marcus had been loud, aggressive, dismissive. They interviewed the FBI agents present. All confirmed David had identified himself clearly, explained the jurisdictional issues multiple times, given Marcus numerous opportunities to leave peacefully. They interviewed Marcus. His story changed as the interview went on. First, he had valid authority. Then, he wasn't aware of federal protection. Then, David had been aggressive, forcing him to respond defensively. The investigators asked if the footage would support his version. Marcus said events moved too quickly to recall exactly what happened. They watched the footage with him. It contradicted multiple parts of his account. The investigation took 3 weeks. The findings were comprehensive and damning. Marcus had attempted to question a patient without consent, warrant, or exigent circumstances. He'd disregarded federal identification. He'd threatened to arrest a federal agent for lawfully performing duties. He'd physically grabbed that agent. He'd reached for his weapon. Each action violated department policy. Several violated professional standards. At least one created potential federal liability. The department recommended termination. Marcus's union representative tried to negotiate. They argued he'd acted based on his suspect description. Wasn't aware of the federal investigation. Felt threatened and acted in self-defense. The disciplinary review board watched the security footage again. They saw no evidence of threat from David. They saw clear evidence of multiple warnings that Marcus ignored. They saw Marcus escalating at every opportunity. The termination was upheld. 23 years. Gone. because of several minutes in a hospital hallway. But it didn't end there. Atlanta PD reported Marcus's termination to the National Decertification Index. A registry tracking officer is terminated for serious misconduct. Being listed makes it extremely difficult to work in law enforcement anywhere in the United States. Marcus tried to appeal. His appeal argued federal agents exceeded their authority. He had valid reasons to investigate. David used excessive force. The appeal was denied. The board noted the footage showed David using minimal appropriate force after Marcus unlawfully grabbed him. Marcus filed a civil lawsuit for wrongful termination. It was dismissed. The court found his own statements plus security footage provided clear grounds for termination. 6 months later, Marcus Shaw was working security at a commercial facility in suburban Atlanta. His law enforcement career was over. David continued his investigation. Carlos Rivera recovered from his injuries. He entered a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. His information and testimony contributed to one of the most successful organized crime prosecutions in recent Atlanta history. 14 convictions, significant asset seizures, major disruption to distribution networks throughout the region. None of that would have happened if David had backed down when Marcus made his demands. None of it would have occurred if Marcus had been allowed to compromise a federal witness. The hospital incident became a case study at the FBI Academy. It's shown to new agents as an example of proper jurisdictional protocols and professional response to interference. The video is used in training modules on interagency cooperation. Atlanta PD incorporated the footage into their training too. Every officer in specialized units reviews it as part of annual training on federal-local cooperation and jurisdictional awareness. The department created new protocols requiring coordination with hospital administration and verification of federal involvement before questioning hospitalized individuals. Let's talk about what really happened here. Because this story is about more than one detective making poor decisions. It's about assumptions. Marcus had 23 years of experience. He'd conducted thousands of investigations. He was used to people deferring to his badge. He expected his authority to be unquestioned. But when Marcus saw David outside that hospital room, he didn't just see someone blocking access. He saw someone in casual clothes. And his brain made assumptions. Despite the FBI credentials visible on David's belt, despite other federal agents nearby, despite multiple indicators this was a federal operation, Marcus's assumptions about who possesses authority and who doesn't were influenced by bias. And those assumptions destroyed his career in minutes. David understood jurisdictional protocols because federal agents must. They work in an environment where jurisdiction is fundamental. They coordinate constantly with local, state, and other federal agencies. They must know precisely where their authority begins and ends. But David also understood something else. Throughout his career, he'd experienced people questioning his authority regardless of his credentials. Local officers assuming he was a subject rather than an agent. People expressing surprise at his position. Defense attorneys trying to undermine his credibility. David had learned to be exceptionally well prepared, thoroughly professional, and absolutely clear about establishing his authority. Because he knew people like Marcus would make assumptions first and ask questions later. That's exactly what happened in that hospital hallway. Here's a question for you. If you were a hospital administrator, what policies would you implement after an incident like this? I really want to know. Drop your answer in the comments. The hospital security footage proved crucial. Without video, this would have been a federal agent's word against a local detective's word. Both law enforcement professionals. Both with institutional credibility. The department might have tried to find middle ground. Maybe a suspension instead of termination. But the cameras captured everything. Marcus's aggression, David's professional composure, the clear warnings, the physical escalation, the weapon reach, all documented from multiple angles with audio. The footage also showed something else. Hospital staff and patients in the background watching this unfold. The disruption to medical operations, the concern on staff faces when Marcus reached for his gun. That footage made it impossible to argue Marcus's actions were reasonable. This case also highlights something that deserves more attention in law enforcement: the cost of failing to address patterns of problematic behavior. Marcus had 9 excessive force complaints over 5 years, 3 lawsuits settled by the city, but he'd never faced meaningful consequences. The department had protected him. They investigated complaints and found them unsubstantiated. They settled lawsuits without holding him accountable. They allowed him to continue with the same aggressive, procedure-minimizing approach that eventually led to the hospital incident. If the department had addressed Marcus's pattern earlier, maybe this never happens. Maybe he gets additional training. Maybe he gets reassigned. Maybe he faces consequences that change his behavior before he creates a situation so problematic and so well documented that termination becomes the only option. Instead, they protected him until he created an incident they couldn't overlook. Some people might argue that David was being territorial, that he could have been more diplomatic, that he could have allowed Marcus brief access to avoid confrontation. Here's why that's wrong. David had spent 14 months building a federal investigation. Thousands of hours of work. Multiple agents assigned to protect his cooperating witness. Carlos Rivera had just been shot, possibly because his cooperation had been discovered. David's responsibility wasn't to accommodate Marcus's unauthorized demands. It was to protect his witness and preserve his investigation's integrity. He identified himself clearly. He explained the jurisdictional issue. He gave Marcus multiple opportunities to leave. When Marcus refused and physically grabbed him, David responded appropriately and professionally. That's not territorial behavior. That's proper execution of federal law enforcement responsibilities. So what are the lessons here? First, understand jurisdictional boundaries. If you work in law enforcement, know precisely where your authority begins and ends. Know when you need a warrant. Know when you need coordination. Know when you're potentially interfering with another agency's operation. Second, recognize and respect credentials. When someone displays federal identification and explains they have jurisdiction, believe them. Don't assume you know better. Don't let pride override procedure. Third, practice de-escalation. Marcus had multiple opportunities to reconsider. Every time David provided an out, Marcus escalated instead. That's how manageable situations become career-ending incidents. Fourth, assume you're being recorded. Hospital cameras, body cameras, phone cameras. In virtually any public space, assume your actions are being documented, because they probably are. Fifth, address patterns before they become major incidents. Marcus's 9 complaints and 3 lawsuits were warning signs the department failed to take seriously. Organizations must identify and address problematic patterns before they result in catastrophic events. As of now, Marcus Shaw no longer works in law enforcement. He lost his appeal regarding pension benefits. He receives reduced retirement benefits based on years of service. He filed for bankruptcy following legal expenses from his appeals and litigation. He hasn't given any public statements about the incident. David Chen was promoted to Supervisory Special Agent 2 years after the hospital incident. He now leads a team of agents working complex federal investigations across the Southeast region. He hasn't given public interviews about the confrontation, though he's discussed it in training contexts with new agents. The federal investigation Carlos assisted with is considered one of the most successful organized crime prosecutions in recent Atlanta history. 14 convictions, significant asset seizures, substantial disruption to distribution networks. None of that would have been possible if David had backed down. Several minutes in a hospital hallway. One detective who assumed his badge meant he didn't need to follow protocols. One federal agent who knew better. And an entire career ended because someone confused authority with unlimited power. Final question for you. What's one thing you learned from this story that you didn't know before? Drop your answer in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. This story matters because it demonstrates that authority has defined boundaries. Police officers have significant power, but that power isn't absolute. It's limited by jurisdiction, by constitutional protections, by federal authority, and by law itself. When officers forget those limitations, when they assume their badge overrides everything else, they create risk for themselves and their departments. They compromise investigations, they violate protocols, they damage their own careers. Marcus Shaw learned that lesson in the most costly way possible. In a hospital hallway, on camera, in front of FBI agents who knew exactly what authority they possessed and how to defend it. The footage from that night is still used in training. You can see a local detective attempting to assert authority he didn't have. You can see a federal agent professionally explaining jurisdictional protocols. You can see the moment when assumptions override good judgment. You can see what happens when several minutes of poor decisions end 23 years of a career. And perhaps the next time an officer considers pushing past someone who explains they don't have jurisdiction, they'll remember this case. They'll remember Marcus Shaw. They'll remember that authority has limits, and exceeding them has consequences. This is the story of how an Atlanta detective tried to access a federal witness and lost everything. But more than that, it's a story about jurisdiction, professional accountability, and why understanding the boundaries of your own authority is as important as knowing how to exercise it. Thanks for watching this story all the way through. If you found this valuable, make sure you're subscribed because I cover more stories like this that need to be told. Drop a comment letting me know what you think should happen in cases like these. See you in the next one.